Gotcha. Okay. So we kind of got there really well. Okay. I want to talk about your other paper where you wrote about, I guess, what this death means in the garden. So before we talk about that, could you possibly just really briefly talk about some general popular views that people take on
Oh, right.
what this death meant when God said, like, you will die?
Hmm. So I just mentioned Peter Machinist's view, and that's when God says you will die, he's saying you're immortal now, but when you eat from the tree, you will become mortal. Death will enter the picture in that way. Um, Other scholars like Ellen Robbins and Mark Smith, I think, talk about a conditional immortality. They were born conditionally immortal, and at least one of those scholars will say they had access to the tree of life and that they had to eat from the tree of life periodically to renew their immortality. But as soon as they're kicked out of the garden, they've lost access to the tree of life. They won't be able to renew their immortality and they will eventually die. So the first view says they're fully immortal. They don't need to keep eating from the tree of life. The second view says they need to keep eating from the tree of life because this immortality is sort of conditional. Um, Another view I think of is that of Bernard Batto, who wrote the book Slaying the Dragon from 1992, which I think is a great book. And he says God hadn't made up his mind yet as to whether or not he would let them eat from the tree of life. So they were conditionally immortal in the sense they were kind of in a liminal state. They were in between mortality and immortality, and it was going to be up to God to decide whether they fell over and onto the mortal side or are the immortal side. But their act of disobedience cut that decision making process short. They decided for God, in a sense, um, to become mortal. So those are some of the views that are out there. I think the first view, that of Peter Machinist and others, is perhaps the more common view among general readers of the Bible, that Adam and Eve were created with immortality, and only by virtue of eating of the fruit did they lose that. And they die. They really did die, people would say, in the sense that they lost their immortality, and that's what God meant all along. I don't agree with that, but it's certainly um, one of the views that exists not just among general readers, but among scholars and professors as well.
Yeah, it's so funny that you lay out each of those views, and each one I'm like, that's really interesting. That seems like it has some good points, and then the next one's like, oh, that also has some good points, and
Mhm.
that's just so fun to me. You mentioned one more in your paper that I found interesting. Mobley, I don't know his first name. He says that they suffer in such a way that the loss may be aptly be described as a death.
Oh, right, Walter
Um,
Moberly. Yes, he and this other, they're both he and James Barr, and they're both British scholars, went back and forth a lot, um, arguing and writing on various things about the Eden story. It's interesting if somebody has lots of time in their hands, they can go get these articles that these two men wrote and get two very different views of the story. But yeah, Moberly says that they don't necessarily lose their immortality, but life changes drastically. Life changes from sort of a good life in the garden to a bad life outside the garden. And it's so bad, it's as if they're living a kind of death because it's so much more difficult. The contrast, maybe this is a better way to say it, the contrast between life outside the garden to life in the garden is as if they died. And I think he's followed by this, or he's followed in this view by other scholars as well. Robert Gordon, who taught at Cambridge, I think follows him. Um, so that's another reasonable view that's out there among scholars.
Awesome. And finally, in regards to views, you hinted at it and maybe even talked a lot about it. Could you give us your view specifically laid out of what this death is?
Yeah. Um, and so my view on the death isn't original with me necessarily. But I do think when God says you will die, he means a regular physical death. And this kind of language he uses, on the day you eat of it, you will die, or you will surely die. That kind of language in the Hebrew Bible almost always means physical death, regular physical death, and it can be used as a kind of judicial verdict to mean you will be put to death as a form of punishment by the authorities that are overseeing this particular issue, whatever it might be. So when God says you will die in Eden, I think he means you will be put to death by me or one of my angelic beings. And there are various reasons for this that I go into in the article, but I think the way in which that language is used in other biblical texts definitely supports my view. The other thing to say is the author of the story strongly implies that there are two main features of divinity in the story. Knowledge is one, and immortality is the other. And these two qualities of divinity are represented by the two trees, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. And when they eat from the tree of knowledge, Yahweh says, uh-oh, the man has become like one of us. He doesn't say the man is one of us. He just says the man has become like one of us, meaning the man has gone from not possessing either of those two qualities of divinity to now possessing one of them. He's 50% of the way there. And again, this is part of the reason I think Yahweh expels them from the garden, is to prevent the man and the woman from gaining full divinity by eating from the tree of life and acquiring immortality. So if you think of these two characteristics, knowledge and immortality, as characterizing God and the other divine beings in that story, then I think you have to think of death as physical death in contrast to everlasting life, which is represented by the tree of life.